It's 2 a.m. in rural Texas, and Pastor Michael Chen isn't sleeping. He's in the basement of his church taking inventory. Rows of water bottles, canned food, medical supplies, and emergency blankets line the walls. His phone buzzes, a text from another pastor 3 states away. "Finish the training. Our team is ready. Are yours?" Michael types back, "Almost. Installing the last of the equipment next week." This isn't a scene from a dystopian film. This is happening right now in churches across America and around the world. For the past 5 years, something extraordinary has been unfolding in the shadows of Sunday services and midweek Bible studies. Pastors, priests, and religious leaders have been quietly, methodically preparing their congregations for something they describe in hushed tones as a time of testing or the coming disruption. They hold special meetings after regular services end, where only trusted members are invited. They're building networks that span denominations. Baptist pastors coordinating with Catholic priests, Methodists sharing resources with Pentecostals. Differences that kept them apart for centuries suddenly don't matter anymore. And here's what makes this truly unsettling. When pressed publicly about what they're preparing for, most won't give a straight answer. They smile, deflect, and change the subject. But behind closed doors, the preparations continue at an accelerating pace. In 2019, the American Pastors Network conducted a survey that revealed something shocking. 73% of evangelical pastors believed that America was approaching a period of significant persecution against Christians within the next decade. That number has only grown. By 2022, it had jumped to 82%. But persecution wasn't the only concern. Economic collapse, civil unrest, natural disasters, and what they cryptically call moral chaos topped their lists of anticipated challenges. Pastor David Wilkerson, who passed away in 2011, wrote a book called The Vision back in 1974. In it, he predicted a coming economic crisis that would shake America to its core. His prophecies, once dismissed by mainstream Christianity, are now being dusted off and re-examined. Churches that once mocked his doom and gloom message are now downloading his sermons and incorporating his warnings into their planning sessions. Some pastors won't mention Wilkerson by name in public, but his books have been quietly circulating through pastoral networks like Samizdat Literature in the Soviet Union. Here's where it gets interesting. Follow the money. In 2015, religious organizations spent approximately $1.2 million collectively on emergency preparedness supplies and training. By 2023, that number had exploded to over $47 million. And these are just the documented, traceable expenses. Countless churches use cash transactions, private donations, and off-the-books purchasing to avoid drawing attention to their activities. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that don't make the evening news but shape the world in profound ways. Before we go further into this rabbit hole, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Are you a pastor yourself, someone who's noticed these changes in your own church, or are you learning about this for the first time? Drop a comment and let me know. The preparations take many forms. In 2018, a church security consultant named Carl Chin published a report documenting that churches in America experience a violent attack on average once every 48 hours. Most are small incidents that don't make national news, threatening individuals, minor assaults, vandalism. But the trend line was undeniable. It was getting worse. By 2022, that number had dropped to one incident every 36 hours. Churches responded by hiring armed security, installing sophisticated camera systems, and training volunteer safety teams. But here's the twist. Pastors say the physical security measures are just the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. Pastor Jim Bakker, the televangelist who spent time in prison for fraud in the 1980s and 90s, reemerged with a new message and a new business, selling emergency food supplies to Christians. His critics called it a grift, another con from a convicted criminal. But Bakker's food bucket sales went through the roof. By 2020, he'd sold millions of dollars worth of freeze-dried food, water filtration systems, and survival gear to churches and individual Christians. When questioned about fear-mongering, Bakker's response was always the same. "I'm not creating fear. I'm responding to what pastors are telling me they're already afraid of." The phenomenon isn't limited to America. In underground networks across China, house church pastors have been preparing for increased government crackdowns for years. They've developed sophisticated communication systems, memorized entire books of the Bible, and created hiding places for religious materials. What's new is that they're now sharing their techniques with Western pastors. Training seminars held in neutral countries like Singapore and South Korea have brought together Christian leaders from China with those from Europe and North America. The Chinese pastors, battle-hardened by decades of actual persecution, are teaching their Western counterparts tradecraft. How to communicate secretly, how to maintain faith under pressure, how to build resilient communities that can survive without buildings or formal structures. One American pastor who attended such a training in 2021 who asked to remain anonymous described it as the most eye-opening week of my life. He said, "These Chinese brothers and sisters showed us what real persecution looks like. They also showed us what real faith looks like. We came back convinced that we needed to prepare our people not for comfort, but for endurance." The real question everyone's avoiding is, what exactly are they preparing for? Ask 10 different pastors, get 10 different answers. Some point to biblical prophecy, specifically the end times scenarios described in the book of Revelation. They cite wars, rumors of wars, pestilence, and earthquakes, all of which they believe are intensifying. They'll show you charts tracking global conflict, pandemic spread, and seismic activity. The data, they insist, shows an acceleration. Others focus on societal collapse. They point to political polarization, the erosion of shared truth, the breakdown of community bonds. Pastor Robert Jeffress of First Baptist Dallas said in a 2022 sermon, one that was quickly removed from the church's website, that America was in a pre-revolutionary state, and that churches needed to be ready to serve as arcs of stability in a flood of chaos. The sermon was scrubbed, but transcripts circulated widely in pastoral networks. Economic concerns run deep. The 2008 financial crisis scared a generation of church leaders who watched their congregations lose homes, jobs, and hope. Many pastors became convinced that an even larger economic catastrophe was inevitable. They started teaching biblical principles of financial preparedness: get out of debt, store food, own tangible assets. Some went further, encouraging their members to invest in gold and silver, citing passages from the Bible about the enduring value of precious metals. Critics called it a prosperity gospel in reverse, preaching poverty instead of wealth. Then there's the technology angle. A growing number of pastors have become deeply suspicious of digital currency, artificial intelligence, and biometric identification systems. They see these technologies as potential tools of oppression, ways to track, control, and ultimately exclude people from economic participation. They reference Revelation 13:17, which describes a time when no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark. Whether this is literal prophecy or symbolic warning, these pastors are taking it seriously. Some are teaching their congregations how to live off the grid, to maintain parallel systems of exchange and community that don't depend on digital infrastructure. In 2020 and 2021, during the COVID-19 pandemic, these preparations were tested. Churches were forced to close, congregations couldn't gather. In some jurisdictions, singing was banned. Pastors were arrested for holding services. For many religious leaders, this was the wake-up call that transformed theoretical preparation into urgent action. Pastor John MacArthur's Grace Community Church in California defied shutdown orders, arguing that government had no authority to prevent religious assembly. The legal battle that followed became a rallying point. Pastors who had been quietly preparing suddenly found their concerns validated. But the pandemic revealed something else. Churches that had prepared fared better. Those that had already set up online systems, had emergency funds, had trained their people in resilience. They adapted faster. They were able to continue serving their communities, distributing food, providing counseling, maintaining connection. The pastors who had seemed paranoid suddenly seemed prescient. What profession do you work in? Does your workplace have emergency plans this detailed? Most companies have fire drills and evacuation procedures, maybe some disaster planning. But what churches are doing goes far beyond that. They're planning for scenarios where normal society has fundamentally broken down, where they might be the only functional institutions left in their communities. The training programs pastors attend now read like something from a government emergency management curriculum. First aid and CPR are just the beginning. They're learning trauma counseling, conflict mediation, food distribution logistics, and security protocols. Some are even receiving training in topics like ministry under surveillance and maintaining faith in hostile environments. A 2023 conference in Tennessee advertised workshops on encrypted communications, legal strategies for religious freedom defense, and, most surprisingly, biblical principles of civil disobedience. This last topic represents a significant shift in evangelical thinking. For decades, American evangelicals preached submission to governmental authority, citing Romans 13. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. But something has changed. More and more pastors are teaching about a higher law, about the apostles' response in Acts 5:29. We must obey God rather than men. They're wrestling with questions their predecessors faced in Nazi Germany or Communist China. When does submission to earthly authority require betrayal of heavenly allegiance? The networking is perhaps the most fascinating aspect. Pastors are building relationships across previously impenetrable boundaries. In Colorado, an evangelical pastor and a Catholic priest have a monthly breakfast where they discuss shared concerns and coordinate preparation efforts. In Michigan, a Baptist church has a formal mutual aid agreement with a Methodist church and a Pentecostal assembly. They've pledged to support each other's congregations in emergency situations. These relationships aren't being publicized. There are no press releases, no social media announcements. The pastors keep quiet about it because they fear ridicule or worse, interference. Some of this coordination happens through established networks. The National Association of Evangelicals has a quiet preparedness division that most members don't even know exists. The Southern Baptist Convention has developed emergency protocols for its 47,000 churches. The Catholic Church has centuries of experience in operating under persecution and has been sharing institutional knowledge with Protestant denominations that are comparative newcomers to such concerns. But much of it happens informally. Pastors meet at conferences, exchange phone numbers, start group chats. These digital fellowships discuss everything from bulk purchasing of supplies to legal strategies for defending religious liberty. Some groups have created code words to discuss sensitive topics on platforms they assume are monitored. Others have abandoned digital communication entirely for in-person meetings. One persistent rumor that circulates in these networks concerns government watch lists. Multiple pastors have reported receiving visits from FBI agents asking about their preparedness activities, their international connections, their teachings on civil authority. These visits are always described as routine and informational, but they leave pastors spooked. Some have consulted lawyers, others have simply become more careful about what they say publicly while continuing their preparations privately. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity. American pastors are connecting with Christian leaders in countries experiencing actual persecution. Pastors from Nigeria, where Boko Haram has killed thousands of Christians, share their experiences. Leaders from the Middle East, where Christianity is vanishing from its ancient homeland, offer warnings. Believers from North Korea, having escaped the world's most oppressive regime, describe what total religious persecution looks like. These aren't theoretical discussions, but they're case studies in survival. A Nigerian pastor named Samuel Kanu, who survived 3 separate Boko Haram attacks on his village, has been touring American churches since 2019. His message is simple. You are not ready. You think you are, but you're not. He describes watching his church building burn, hiding in the bush for days, losing members of his congregation to violence. Then he looks at American churches with their security systems and emergency food storage and says, "This is good, but it's not enough. You must prepare the heart, not just the building." His challenge resonates because it cuts to a deeper question. Are these preparations driven by faith or by fear? Critics within Christianity argue that all this preparation represents a lack of trust in God's provision. They cite Jesus' teaching in Matthew 6, "Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink. Look at the birds of the air, they do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. If God cares for sparrows, won't He care for His people?" The pastors who are preparing have answers to this. They distinguish between worry and wisdom, between faith and foolishness. They point to Joseph storing grain in Egypt, to Noah building an ark, to Jesus telling his disciples to take provisions when they traveled. Preparation, they argue, is not opposed to faith. It's an expression of it. God warns people, then expects them to act on those warnings. The theological debates get heated. In some denominations, pastors who are openly preparing have been criticized or even removed from their positions. Church hierarchies don't want to be associated with what might look like extremism or doomsday cultism. So the pastors learn to be subtle. They frame their preparations as wisdom or stewardship or community resilience. They avoid apocalyptic language in public while using it freely in private. The money flowing into this movement is significant. Companies serving the Christian preparedness market have exploded. My Patriot Supply, a major emergency food company, reports that 40% of its customer base identifies as evangelical Christian. Frontline Defense, which provides security training specifically for churches, has grown from 3 employees in 2015 to over 50 in 2023. Publishers are churning out books with titles like The Coming Chaos, Prepare Living Your Faith in Tough Times, and When the Grid Goes Down, a Christian Survival Guide. If you're finding this information valuable and you want to support independent research into these hidden stories, consider leaving a super thanks. It directly helps us continue investigating the narratives that mainstream media overlooks. But whether you contribute or not, I want to hear your thoughts on this in the comments. The question of timing haunts these preparations. When will whatever they're preparing for actually happen? Some pastors speak in vague terms, soon or within this generation. Others are more specific, though they rarely share their timeline publicly. Pastor Greg Laurie, in a sermon series in 2022, suggested that global conditions were aligning in ways that suggested we could be the generation that sees the return of Christ. He immediately clarified that no one knows the day or hour, but the implication was clear. Time is short. This sense of urgency drives the pace of preparation. Churches that might normally deliberate for months over purchasing decisions are moving quickly. Building projects that would typically face congregational votes are being fast-tracked by leadership teams. The usual democratic processes of church governance are being bypassed in the name of urgency. Some church members are uncomfortable with this shift, but they're told that time is running out. The pandemic accelerated everything. What had been theoretical became real. Churches that had stored food used it to feed their communities. Those that had trained medical personnel deployed them. The pastors who had seemed extreme suddenly seemed essential, and the congregations that had questioned the preparations became believers. Post-pandemic, the pace hasn't slowed, it's increased. A survey of Saudi's 200 pastors by the Barna Group in 2023 found that 68% had increased their emergency preparedness efforts since 2020. 54% reported spending church funds on security and supplies. 41% had conducted emergency drills with their congregations. These aren't fringe churches, this is mainstream American Christianity. The younger generation of pastors is driving much of this. Millennials and Gen Z religious leaders have grown up in a world of school shootings, terrorism, economic instability, and climate anxiety. They don't remember the stable, prosperous post-war period their predecessors knew. They assume disruption is normal. For them, preparation isn't paranoia, it's prudence. These young pastors are also more comfortable with tactical equipment and security thinking. Many served in the military during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They know weapons, strategy, and threat assessment. They're bringing that expertise into their ministries. The image of a pastor has shifted. It's no longer just someone in a suit holding a Bible. Increasingly, it's someone who can also conduct a security briefing and organize a logistics operation. The political dimension can't be ignored. Many of these pastors have deep concerns about the direction of government. They fear that religious liberty is eroding, that values they hold sacred are being criminalized. They watch political developments obsessively. Some have become quasi-political organizers, though they'd never describe themselves that way. They mobilize their congregations to vote, to advocate, to resist policies they see as dangerous. This has led to accusations that the church is being weaponized for political purposes. Critics argue that these pastors are creating armed, organized, ideologically motivated groups that could become dangerous. They point to January 6, 2021, when the Capitol was stormed, noting that many participants had religious motivations and church connections. They worry about Christian nationalism, about the blurring of faith and ideology. The pastors dismiss these concerns. They argue they're not creating militants, they're creating resilient communities that can survive whatever comes. They're not plotting violence, they're preparing to help people. They're not stockpiling weapons, they're stockpiling food and water. And while some do have armed security teams, these are purely defensive. Yet the line between preparation and mobilization can be thin. A church with trained security, stored supplies, encrypted communications, and a tightly knit congregation that sees itself as separate from and opposed to broader society that starts to look less like a religious community and more like something else. The pastors insist they're peaceful, but they're also prepared to defend themselves and their people if necessary. The biblical justification for armed defense is complex. Most point to Luke 22:36, where Jesus tells his disciples, "If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." Others cite Nehemiah 4, where the rebuilders of Jerusalem's walls worked with weapons at hand, ready to defend against attack. The theological gymnastics required to reconcile turn the other cheek with armed security teams is considerable, but these pastors have worked it out to their satisfaction. What's perhaps most striking is the silence from church leadership at the highest levels.